Hello, class. This is Module 3. I'm Ray Hagerman, your instructor, and I wanted to make sure that we pay particular attention this week to the fundamentals of CBA. As you see in the required materials for this week, I've included an overview of the economic analysis for a USACE inland navigation, where a gentleman named Patrick Donovan has actually done a cost-benefit analysis for building new and repairing locks on the system to show how it benefits, and we're due an actual CBA on whether or not they should spend the money to increase the locks. So I think reading over that and being familiar with that makes some sense. I have embedded a couple of slides of that presentation in this presentation. Um, there are notes that are written out here for you to read if you don't even want to listen to me. I'm very self-aware and understand that sometimes my voice can put people to sleep. It's been done in the past. It doesn't hurt my feelings at all. If you'd rather just read the notes as opposed to listen to me, that's totally fine. Um, but also, I'd like to make sure that you understand that the reason we included also the Harburger triangle in the wiki as to welfare economics. I think even though the three sides of the Harburger triangle article by Hines is pretty dated, it's from December of 1998. It still holds very true, especially in the appendices where you can see you can see where the dead weight loss is. And I think that's important for everybody to understand the concept of where dead weight loss comes into play. The whole notion of welfare economics, we'll talk about that a little bit later in this module. But it's good that you don't need to remember a great deal of this other than to understand the logic behind it. So, without further ado, kind of moving forward, as you know, the previous two modules really had to do with foundational concepts in economics, whereas this week is where we will definitely start talking about the fundamentals of CBA per se. So let's start with that. I'll move to um, the rest of this. Let's see, let's go forward on. Okay, here we go. So the agenda for this one is want to talk a little bit about what is CBA, um, the welfare economics and kind of the theory behind CBA. I'm not going to read all these out to you, but notice that there are definite differences between financial and economic returns, and that there is a way to estimate cost and benefits in CBA studies in undistorted markets, distorted markets, and then some of the other externalities. Even though I'll talk through these and I will breeze through some of these slides, I will tell you that, sorry about that. I will tell you that it is not all that important to be able to make those calculations in distorted and undistorted markets in the back, but I do want you to know that because there may be a question or two, just generally speaking, as to those graphs and kind of what they mean and what some of those definitions are. But as usual, I'll kind of signal some things that I definitely think that you need to know for purposes of the test. So the agenda here, obviously, we're going to talk about how to estimate costs and benefits in CBA studies, especially as they relate to a tax incentive package in in the economic development field. That'll be primarily what you're going to be seeing more of anything in terms of CBAs in economic development. I included the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers CBA study simply to show you kind of how some of those presentations are done and some of the logic that goes behind them. But note that really what we're trying to do is make that transition, that analogy of doing it for Corps of Engineers type projects to how you will be doing projects like this in economic development. Primarily, a lot of your CBAs are going to be what do we do for a potential deal, a potential project in our community, and how do we evaluate that if we do offer them an incentive package, what is that? What are the cost benefits going to be for our community? So be sure you keep that as the overarching in mind about what we are doing here as we're laying this foundation. The main thing is that I will definitely try to make these connections as we're moving through this particular module as to how it impacts your group project. Your group project is about evaluating what a tax incentive impact is going to be on the St. Tammany Parish. That's it in a nutshell. So let's just keep in mind that as we're moving through um, this module. So what is CBA? We've talked about that before, but just to reiterate, it's a tool for calculating the economic benefits of a project to make sure that its benefits to society exceed its cost to society. And we'll talk a little bit about how those are derived going forward. So here's where I plucked 4 or 5 slides from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers study. In a nutshell, what they're laying out here in front of you is looking at, they have tallied up what the cost, what the benefits are, and what the incremental costs are in a CBA study. So um, just in terms of terminology here, the WOPC, that stands for uh, without project condition. So that means what if we do absolutely nothing? This is what's going to happen. And then the other ones are with project conditions. And in this case, they have an alternative A and alternative B, and they have definitely isolated what those costs and benefits are, what the incremental costs and benefits are. So for example, in this case on Alt A and Alt B, you have 10,250. I think these are in thousands, so that would be in the millions. Um, and you can see that Alt B, which is a condition where there is higher traffic, it's better that they do it that way. What the BCR is, and ding ding, you probably will see this again, but the benefit cost ratio is simply what is the benefit number over the cost number, with the cost number being the denominator, right? So if the cost benefit ratio is greater than 1, and that's written down at the bottom of this page, greater than 1, then you probably should do it. In this case, both of these make sense for them to do. Looks like Alt A has the better cost benefit ratio or benefit cost ratio at 1.87 versus 1.64. So anytime you have benefits that have a higher than 1 benefit cost ratio, you probably should do it. Moving on, just to show a little bit of how that private investments, just like in our group project, receiving tax incentives almost invariably involve an element of increased demand. So as you can see in this particular case, I realize we're talking about lock traffic, but by doing this project, they will see demand increase. And that's what you normally will see is as we look at alternatives, the case is, yes, we will see increased demand, but what we always want to make sure of is that that increased demand, which will ultimately result in net benefits, is it better than the net cost that we're going to incur? Supply and demand framework, we've seen these graphs before, these scissors graphs. In this particular case, the supply shifts outward, and what happens there? So in this particular case, increasing the supply of infrastructure as a result of lowering the costs ultimately to consumers. As you can see, the price 0 goes down to price 1. This is an example of increasing supply of infrastructure. This is what Donovan's using in his example. By increasing the capacity of the lock on the inland waterway, he's actually causing a decrease in price for the consumer, which is a good thing. So demand framework, this is the final slide really that has been borrowed from Donovan. This shows a tangible example of a shift in supply. By closing the lock on the waterway, it can increase the costs. So, and the reason it does so is because it causes delays while they close the locks in order to do that. This one, I did not ask you to look at an EPA study, so I just plucked this. So disregard that last statement that says, notice this chart is from one of the charts from the EPA appendix. It actually does come from that article, but I didn't ask you to read it. I just wanted to reiterate to you kind of the elements in the scissor chart that shows where the consumer surplus is and where the producer surplus is. So by at the equilibrium point, as you will see, that anything below that line of equilibrium is producer surplus inside of the supply curve, and anything inside of the supply and demand curve that is above the price is actually consumer surplus. So let's talk a little bit about welfare economics. Don't get confused with the notion of like welfare checks or whatever. I don't even think anybody even calls them that ever anymore. What we're not talking about is welfare like in transfer payments that are made to people or consumers. We're talking about the notion of welfare being um, uh, just welfare, meaning that it's the idea of actually improving the material well-being of society by increasing the efficiency of which society uses its resources. That's where we come up with the possibilities of these CBA projects, is that by spending this money and increasing the efficiency of certain things in a community by doing a project, for example, what are we actually doing for benefit of the community? Can we actually see some increase in the welfare, if you will, to society by doing these projects? So one of the things that we keep in mind when we are looking at welfare, since this notion is a little bit different than just financial returns, because of course we have to figure out what are all the returns, some of which can't be exactly defined uh, by financial means. So we referred to some work that was done back in the 19th century, where an Italian scientist, he was an economist and a sociologist. His name was Vilfredo Pareto, and this is where we come up with the concept of Pareto distribution, Pareto efficiency, Pareto frontier. And just for your edification, ding ding, remember this: Pareto efficiency and Pareto optimality are exactly the same things. And the thing you need to remember about, and it's on the next slide as well, about Pareto efficiency or Pareto optimality, is it's an allocations of goods whereby at, if you move from one point to the other, that we the optimality is if you move in one way or the other, you make one person worse off if you make one person better off. So the best way to say that is an allocation of goods is Pareto efficient if no alternative allocation can make at least one person better off without making anybody else worse off. So usually we say that becomes Pareto efficient at that point. Where he came up with the sort of 80-20 rule, I know we've heard that in our entire lives, that 80% of the people do 20% of the work and 20% of the people do 80% of the work, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Pareto actually did some studies and found out that during this period of the mid to late 1800s, that actually 80% of the land in Italy was owned by 20% of the families. So what what the idea here is he's trying to find something to figure out how can we better distribute income and wealth across a greater number of people. So again, we use this 80-20 rule uh, across a lot of disciplines, but just suffice it to say that there is, in fact, sort of a graph that you can use. And the best way to kind of look at this, and again, restating the fact that it's an allocation of goods where no alternative allocation can make at least one person better off without making somebody else worse off. If you'll look at this graph, you'll see that another way to express this is that if a payment to person one that started with $25 and the payment to person two also started with $25. There's a point which they come together that you see there, and we call that the status quo point, right? So in all of the CBA projects where we're looking to make an investment, we always start with the status quo. So, or sort of like in the Army Corps of Engineers Donovan presentation, um, without project condition, right? So you're not doing a project, you're maintaining the status quo. Well, there are a number of opportunities there that we would call Pareto improvements. That is the blue area shaded, whereby we could move the needle toward one other person and we wouldn't necessarily make person number two worse off. And so that area is shaded in blue here. And the best way to look at this is making one person better off and considering person number two to be everybody else in society. So you can see how that lays out on the graph that if you were to take $100 and split it up a variety of different ways or move it one direction versus the other direction, there's a finite area that we would call the Pareto frontier where it could be moved and um, still not damage that other person. They wouldn't be worse off than they were. They would still have the $25, but by moving outside those parameters, you actually would be making that person worse off, as you can see. But the whole thing with practice is the Pareto optimality principle makes a lot of sense. However, but in all honesty, it's almost impossible to achieve. But in practice, we'll say it's the practice of measuring policies against the status quo to determine if any of the alternatives represent a Pareto improvement. So really what we're going to be able to tell through CBA a CBA project is that we will have some Pareto improvement, but we will almost never, and in fact, I would submit we will never have actual Pareto optimality. But as long as we get Pareto improvement, to some degree, we should be satisfied with it. Alternatives to Pareto efficiencies. Um, there's another criterion called Calder-Hicks. The best way to describe this is that um, create a policy that creates net positive benefits. Um, yes, there will be winners in a particular policy, but you need to be able to try to make some sort of compensation available to the losers in said project. So, I mean, it's one of those things where, somebody is always going to be better off than the other people. But what Calder-Hicks seeks to do is to say, okay, well, the people that are better off or the person better off, there should be a way for that person to, in some way, compensate the loser so that we have more of a balance. In theory, it's sort of impossible to do, but it is a way of trying to deal with the whole notion of Pareto efficiency. So that's what Calder-Hicks is, just to give you some other opportunities. The reality in CBA actually is that every policy that gets done in a community, for example, if we're looking at the group project, yes, somebody is going to be better off by locating a brand new project, a company locating that's creating jobs, right? Somebody's going to be better off. Ostensibly, the project sponsor is going to be better off because they're locating something that they're going to be making money at in the area. The people generally should be better off because they're either going to be working for that company that is creating the project, or they're going to have some benefit because those workers are going to be paying money to purchase products and services in the area. So ostensibly, they should be better off. But let's just say hypothetically, with the metal manufacturers, um, are the people within a couple of blocks of them going to hear them working at all hours of the night and hammering on metal and hearing machines running and that sort of thing, and hearing trucks going inside and out. We could say, well, that's a cost in some way to the residents in the area. And let's say that resident doesn't work for that company, and that person doesn't necessarily see any benefits from doing trade or commerce with that company. Schools might be better and their kids are better educated as a result or something like that. But nonetheless, that person is actually going to be experiencing some sort of loss situation because, we'll call it the loss of quiet enjoyment by having all that banging of the metal happening. So there's no way to actually, somebody's always going to be a loser. If there's a winner, somebody's always going to be a loser. So what we're seeking to do in CBA is to try to, if at all possible, minimize the number of losers. But sometimes that simply means that is there so much net benefit to the society that it overcomes the net disbenefit or the net cost to society, and in that case we choose to do it. So reiterating a lot of those, but the fact of the matter is it's almost impossible to measure the exact costs and benefits at the level of the individual. And if we actually could do that to achieve Pareto optimality, the administrative cost of doing that would be so high, there's no real way that we could do it. So like I said before, it's a nice theory and concept and to help us determine some level of efficiency, but it's not really usable in practice. But let's talk about so we get the overall framework at that point. So now let's look at, okay, well, how do we look at a project? How do we start looking at a project? How do we get to a project framework that sort of deals with what we're going to do with the CBA, how to construct it, how we first look at things. So let's look at a CBA ostensibly for investment decisions. And why this is important is because that's exactly what we're looking to do in the group project. Project Indianapolis, in this case, is going to be looking to come here. We would like for them to come here, we think, but let's look at what are the options going to be if we offer them different tax incentive packages. So we'll look at it from an investment decision. Investment projects are always the basis first of CBA. I won't even go into the textbook definition. You can read that. But the traditional approach is to consider economic and financial components separately. The financial components are going to be the ones that you can actually measure that will show for benefit or, for that matter, disbenefit, I guess, to the sponsor of the project. Those things are ascertainable by measurement. What isn't always ascertainable is the complete panorama of economic benefits to the community, and that's what we are seeking to do. Think of CBA projects always as incremental activities. So in other words, we have a status quo, we have a number of people in our community that work, number of people that live, a number of people that are entitled to some sort of level of quiet enjoyment. But by adding and we know there's activity in the community already. So if we do nothing, it's going to be the same as it was before. But if we add the element of this CBA project incrementally, what are the outputs going to be? Incrementally, what are the job growth numbers going to look like? And incrementally, what are some of those costs going to be to our community? Usually looking at this is a good way. We're sort of delving a little bit into project management theory here, or if not theory, certainly practice. And that is, how do we look at a project? So let's just start from square one with this as we are looking to come to the parameters for our CBA. Is we first need to think of this as the potential for the stages that we need to look at when we're deciding whether we should or should not do an appraisal. So we kind of start with the idea. Somebody comes up with an idea of why we should do something. In this case, we're looking at somebody did a good job of recruiting a company, getting them interested in the community, and sort of defining what that project actually is. Then we kind of go through a pre-feasibility stage onto a feasibility stage, and then we do some detailed design of what the project's actually going to look like. And then we do project implementation. At the very end, though, what we ought to also do is a little bit of post examination of the project if it actually happens, and see if what we thought was supposed to happen and what we desired to happen, did it actually happen? And that's critically important sometimes when you're doing these things, is you want to make sure that, number one, you looked at it correctly from the very beginning, and B, did you learn anything? Were there things that you didn't think about that you should have thought about, and now you're dealing with some issues that you didn't realize you were going to have to deal with? Okay, so we start with making the world a better place, right? With the idea we're going to make our community better because we're going to do this economic development project. Well, the first thing we have to do, again, this is getting technical. You are not going to be responsible for this on your test. I'm just going to tell you that right now. But as a practical matter, in your economic development career, you're going to have to take some of these steps. Number one, you got to look at things like the demand module, like that's real simple. And that is there actually demand for this? Do we need jobs in our community? Well, usually the answer is yes. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes you're in a community where there's been so much economic development activity over the last several years that you are in a situation where you just can't find people. You don't have enough infrastructure in place. You don't have enough housing. You don't have enough healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. What does the demand module actually look like for this project? That may determine whether or not you need to look further. Follow it up by looking at the technical engineering side of things. If you want to locate the company at a particular site, will it work? If they need 20 acres, do they need 20 acres that doesn't have a creek running through it, like a project I'm working on right now? We had to move the company essentially across the street at the industrial park because the lot that they really wanted, they couldn't build the building. The footprint wouldn't fit on that lot because there's a blue stream going through it that we just couldn't account for. Labor and admin support. Do we have enough people to support this company? Do we have enough um, uh, other services that can support the company when they do move in? Financial budget model. Okay, can they make this work? Can they make money at it? How's this going to come together? Do they want to lease the project? Do they want to buy the property? And if so, how does that look like financially? What does that look like? Does it make sense for the company? And certainly, can the community pull it together? Can the community make the loan? Can the community come up with the resources to build the building and lease it to the company? Those are all things that need to make sense. The economic module, obviously, what are the impacts to the community? Environmental impact, depending on what kinds of companies you have moving to your area. If the project has some negative effects to the local environment, you need to take those into consideration. You got to determine what the environmental impact actually is. Most cases these days, when you're looking to locate a project, you usually have to have a study to find out that you don't have any archaeological issues. You do a phase one environmental to see if there's anything that requires cleanup. The company has to file an air permit to find out if they're going to be in attainment or not. Depending on what it is that they produce, they may or may not add or detract from the amount of pollution that already exists in the community. Those are all things that matter. And then last but not least is a stakeholder module where, at the end of the day, it may sound good to everybody on paper, but does the community really want it? I mean, sometimes you have communities where, and believe me, I've dealt with this directly as well, is you're going to have people that maybe they're in close proximity to the project and where it's going to be built, and they think it's going to be smelly, they think it's going to be loud, they think it's going to increase traffic, et cetera, et cetera. There's the old NIMBY principle that people have, not in my backyard. There are people always that are going to not be so pleased that this thing is happening in your community that everybody or most of the people think is a good thing. There are some stakeholders sometimes that just don't appreciate it, and maybe it's not going to be beneficial because not enough people are really for it. So it doesn't matter what you think. and how economically feasible it is if people don't want it. Again, I'm breezing through this. Feasibility study is more an in-depth look at things. Once you've sort of passed muster with that initial cut, dig in deeper. Detailed design of this is that you actually do put pen to paper, you figure out what this is going to look like, what are the impacts going to be. You're usually at the point where you're ready to select a construction company. There's site preparation that has to be done and all those kinds of things. So all of that has to be a plan to make sure that you're doing all the things that you need to do to make sure that the design of the project is actually something that can be implemented, which brings us to project implementation. There's final negotiations for, I'm dealing with a particular situation right now where the announcement's been made for the company. There had been some assurances that, yeah, once the financial package comes together, we're ready to deal with it. But everything is full steam ahead on the project, including the construction, site preparations going on right now. But the construction loan has not yet been closed because there's a consortium of banks that are making the loan, and a couple of them have not finished their underwriting yet. And, we're going to be needing to write some checks here in the next 6 weeks or so. And we don't have the construction loan in place yet. I'm not worried about it, but those are things that sometimes happen. But that's part of the project implementation. Ex post evaluation, you always need to look and see, okay, how did we do? What was it that we did right? What did we do wrong? What did we forget to account for? And that's particularly important. The more complex your CBA project is did I account for all the costs, and did I account for all the benefits? And so therefore, what the conclusion I came to was that actually a reasonably accurate conclusion, because did I include all those things? And furthermore, what we expected to happen, did it actually happen? And that's always important because, as they say in the entrepreneurial world, what you don't know is what kills you. This is a way that you can better do the next project by understanding how you can avoid missing out on some of the other things that you forgot to account for. A financial and economic appraisal is usually how you look at things. And quickly, easily said, is that the financial appraisal is, will the revenues pay the expenses? Are they better? Are you going to come out with more revenues than you are expensive? If you are, then it's probably a go. The economic side of it is, however, looking not just financial side of it, but will society itself, and when I say society, I'm generally talking about the local economy, is that we need to look at it and see that, yeah, it makes sense on paper financially, but will it really benefit the community? And that's the thing that we have to keep track of. Will it benefit to the community far more than the costs that are going to be had for the community and beyond the project's owners and sponsors? So usually the issue in CBA comes up when you have different perspectives for stakeholder impacts. And as we said a few slides back, that the more complex we are in a modern economy, we absolutely know that there will be winners and losers, but usually those are hard to sometimes measure, but even more so, the winners usually are a different set than the losers. Take, for example, if you decided to do a project in a particular community and it involved a piece of property that is currently owned by an individual. Maybe he has a farm. He or she has, I don't know, 20 acres, and they have goats and they have a cow, and they kind of enjoy their just sort of simple lifestyle. But that particular location is the perfect location to put a company that is going to create 250 jobs and sort of elevate the level of economic prosperity for the entire community. The loser is clearly the person who liked their lifestyle and owned that property. The winners are going to be probably everybody else in the community. But at the same point in time, we know that we've got to be able to look at things in a community perspective and go, are there going to be more winners than losers? And if so, are we willing to take the heat for the for creating the losers that we just created? But who gains and loses is an important policy issue because honestly, sometimes it's not just about sheer numbers. It's not just about the number of people that win versus the number of people that lose. Sometimes it's who actually wins because whether we want to agree to it or not, people in different communities have different levels of influence. And if somebody who has a great deal of influence in the community doesn't really want to do a project, sometimes it doesn't matter how many other people in the community don't want to do it if that individual does want to do it. So those are things that we always need to keep in mind with the CBA is there are differing perspectives. Um, Differences in financial and economic analysis. Financial analysis is of interest to the bankers. It's of interest to investors. It's of interest certainly to the sponsors of the project because theoretically they're going to make money. And budget officials, if somebody in the government is like, oh yeah, by doing this project as a result of our CBA, we find out that there's going to be a lot more tax revenues. So of course we're for it. So it's of interest to us, right? How's it going to impact our budget? The economic analysis, though, deals more with the impact on society as a whole. How many jobs is it going to create? Is it going to be of benefit to people? Is it going to make our schools better? Is it going to mean we're going to have better health care, et cetera, et cetera? And here's a very prime example. I have an industrial park where there's some flooding problems on part of the industrial park that affect every resident within a quarter to a half mile area by virtue of the fact that there's going to be an economic development project that happens there, it's going to enable us to fix the flooding problem. So ostensibly, you would say that everybody's going to benefit. Well, there's particularly one person who, at this point in time, doesn't think he's going to benefit. So those are issues that we have to deal with. That sometimes good things affect everybody, and the rising tide does in fact float all boats, as it were. However, sometimes there are specific losers, even when everybody else just about is going to win. But that's part of the economic analysis. That's not the financial analysis. So when financial analysis or when financial benefits equal economic benefits, that's always a great thing. Sometimes, well, I just kind of mentioned one. When my flooding problem goes away by virtue of the fact that this new project came into being. So even though something looks good to the bankers and the investors, does it in fact look good to a lot of other people? And what we are always hoping is that the financial benefits and the economic benefits are all going to be positive all the time. That's not practical, but that's the goal. This is a really good slide to sort of determine that, there are always uh, different perspectives when we look at CBA, and sometimes it lends itself to different calculations. For example, in what we are doing um, in our group project, there are going to be a couple of different perspectives, and one of which is what is the benefit to the parish or the county, um, and what is the benefit going to be to the state? I know in Kentucky, if you have a company, all sales taxes in Kentucky go to the state. We have no ability to levy sales tax at the community level. And so if we bring in a company and they charge sales tax to their customers, all that money goes to the state. So the state's going to see things from a different perspective sometimes than the locals, because the locals are going to look at the sales tax and they're just going to go, so what? That doesn't do anything for us. That only helps the state. So from the state's perspective, hey, it's a great project. We want that. But from the local perspective, it may or may not be as important. and this is probably a little bit, I'll try to see if I can uh, make this a little bigger so you can see it a little bigger. But anytime the net benefits, those actually equal the aggregate gains and losses to all of the groups in society. And that's part of what a CBA does is it stacks and identifies what are all the benefits to everybody, what are all the costs to everybody, and then you aggregate those. So that's what the net benefit is. And of course, uh, the issue becomes the decision point becomes if the aggregate net benefits minus the costs, of course, to all stakeholders is greater than zero, then chances are the project is, in fact, a net benefit to society and should be done. Okay, so that's why we actually do CBAs, so we can determine if, in fact, the benefits minus the cost to all stakeholders is, in fact, greater than zero. If it is, then of course we want to look at it. But from the perspective of the project sponsors, the workers, the residents of the community or the county or the country, as the case may be, the consumers, are prices going to go up or down, or is it going to affect other people? And then lastly, government. Government's always going to be affected one way or another. If the project happens, are we going to get more tax revenues? And if we're going to get more tax revenues, are we going to have to deliver more services? And again, that's somewhat where the calculations are going to come from in the group project is when you look at St. Tammany's financials and so forth, you know that, and in the given information that I've given you in the project is that, the households have a certain number of kids that are going to be going to school. Okay, so if we're going to get more tax revenues that's going to flow as a result of the taxing structure to the school system, is that going to be enough to actually educate that extra, 1.5 kids or whatever that are going to be going to the school? And if it's not, then that's kind of a different perspective of cost benefit than the rest of the community. Like we don't want to put deals on the table that cause us to, lay out more costs than than we're going to be gaining, even if it gives everybody good jobs and so forth. At the end of the day, is the school going to be able to get enough money to educate the kid? And so that's why we have differing perspectives and why it leads to sometimes different calculations. Okay, all right. So this is just a spreadsheet that kind of lays all of that out, as you can see. Sorry about that. From the viewpoint of the owner, the banker, the government, the country, the financial analysis may be different from the economic analysis, and we are able to actually put those numbers on paper based on how we analyze these things. And that's exactly what you're doing in your group project. It's not, again, it's not super difficult. It's just a matter of making sure that you get everything that you need to get in there. So the net formula benefit doesn't always hold when economic prices differ from market prices due to things like taxes or subsidies or price controls, or when economic financial costs of capital differ due to financial subsidies or grants of land where land's been given away, or cash incentives actually happen that decrease the cost of capital. You always need to make some adjustments to actually be able to recognize the net benefits, the economic and financial returns. I mean, it sort of stands to reason, but it just bears stating out loud. So when we look at this a little bit more, we find out that, the first principle when you're quantifying costs and benefits is that benefits and costs of a project are due only to the changes in the costs and benefits that accrue from the project. So we don't want to find that we're measuring, all we really want to do with a CBA is to measure the change. The status quo, the change from the status quo, right? And so just so you know as well, anytime we talk about project inputs and the outputs, you've got to assess both of those. And just for purposes of our continuing terminology discussions, anytime we're talking about inputs, we're talking about costs, and anytime we're talking about outputs, we're talking about benefits. So, but the issue then becomes we have distorted and undistorted markets. We like to deal with undistorted markets because we don't have to account for as many things. But in this particular case, we're gonna describe the differences. Okay, so while as undistorted markets are rare in practice, they are a good starting point for just sort of understanding how that taxes and subsidies affect the allocation of resources. You remember our old circular flow model, leakages as taxes, for example. What would an injection be? A subsidy, you know. So we are going to find that there are um, uh, that these in fact do distort markets, but we're going to pretend like for the time being that they actually don't. The common attributes of undistorted markets is that a marginal price to the consumer actually equals the marginal cost to the producer, and the point where they supply and demand curves intersect is 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 where the equilibrium point is where those two things intersect. And we've talked about that before. Let's talk a little bit about, that's why I put the Harburger triangle in there to show you where the dead weight was. Just a few postulates to kind of remember about Harburger. Economic benefits of a project is the price for an incremental unit of the project output in a competitive market. The second is that the economic cost of a project, or the resource cost, is the price for an incremental unit of supply in a competitive market. Sort of easy concept. Costs and benefits are then aggregated without regard of who the gainers or the losers are in a particular project. And in a competitive market, supply price and demand price will be equal, meaning that the net benefit, the net financial benefit, and the net economic benefit are going to be equal, right? So then it kind of goes back to our economic benefits in the undistorted market. You remember seeing this two or three different times now. If you see where the demand curve is based on the quantity and the price, you'll see that the consumers are willing to pay more for the project, or actually the benefit that the consumers get that is over the price that they're actually paying. All of that is what we call that consumer surplus. Conversely, the same is true that producers are willing to sell for less, they're willing to at a particular price, they're willing to generate more product, but in fact, they're able to charge more than they would have been willing to do. So therefore, that difference there is the producer surplus. So, but then what we need to also remember is that by putting both the profit and the consumer surplus together, that's where we get the net benefit. So if you add the profit uh, from the producers and the surplus that the consumers are getting, then that's what we call the net benefits. And those are the net benefits that we're going to use to be our top line, if you will, for CBA projects. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time with any of these charts for the next probably 4 or 5 slides, but just suffice it to say, ding, ding, that you may see this particular graph again. And in this particular case, what we're seeing with the ABC triangle, which is the you see it sitting on top of what we consider um, the gross benefits. The net effect of the project, or the net benefits, consist of the difference between the gross benefits and the gross cost. So this triangle that you see, ABC, is actually the net effect of the project. Okay. So just think about that for the future. Um, where we go from here is we look at input costs in an undistorted market. Why do we even show this? It's because not all projects create economic benefits. In this particular case, the net costs are higher than the net benefits. That's why you have instead of a triangle that points northward, you got one that points downward, right? Because you're actually delving into the producer surplus, and thus it's actually the costs are more than the net benefit. So you have a net negative situation that happens. Um, just to kind of recap this a little bit, um, unless CBA projects affect prices, we can usually assume that the returns to owners are the equal to society, and we know that that isn't actually going to be true in almost any situation, but it's something that we would like to see happen. In most cases, however, economic developers can assume that the social costs and benefits are equal to benefits and costs. So I think that sort of speaks for itself, but just bear that in mind as you look at this from the perspective of I'm an economic developer and how can I look at these appropriately? Again, as you're looking at a project, always look to see that the returns to the owner, you're always going to assume that the returns to the owner are the same things as the social returns. Um, but you also need to take into consideration any net costs to the consumers as well, or to society rather than just the owners. All right, so let's turn from undistorted markets to kind of distorted markets. We talked about these two in the circular flow model and different things like that as to how these distortions happen, some of which are leakages, some of which are interjections, right? Or injections. We have taxes. That's going to, somebody has to pay that, right? Either the consumer or the producer does. Subsidies. Sometimes subsidies are given by government in order to have something um, more, want to see more things happen that they don't normally see happen. For example, um, you know, people with electric vehicles have historically gotten subsidies for purchasing an electric vehicle. Why is that? Because the government would rather see low carbon footprint vehicles as opposed to ones that use internal combustion engines. And so they subsidize that. So sometimes you're going to get more of something because you in fact subsidize it. Sometimes you're going to get less of other things because why? Because you tax them. Consumption or trade taxes are probably the most widely shown example across the United States because sales taxes are pretty much ubiquitous across the United States in some way or another. Either they're at the state level or they're at the local level or both. Sometimes markets get distorted by having to have licenses to do certain things or quotas. I mean, you could even look at quotas from the standpoint of what if I'm a fisherman and I make my living by going out to the river and I catch catfish or whatever. Well, if I'm only allowed to catch so many catfish, that quota is going to impact how many I can sell. If I could sell 100, but I can only take 50 as a quota, well, I just missed out on a sale of 50, right? So the market can be distorted through quotas. Monopoly markets exist. Oh my goodness. That's probably the biggest issue that we have in economic development sometimes is the fact that we have power and utility um, monopolies. Like in Kentucky, for example, the entire footprint of Kentucky is segmented out to utility users. Sometimes it's smaller collectives but there are big for-profit companies that actually have big pieces of the electric market, and it is a monopoly. No one else is allowed to enter that market. So the only way it's controlled is through public service commissions that allow regulations. Uh, and it causes distortion. Believe me, it causes distortion. Environmental externalities, carbon taxes, people that um, we can look at the market getting distorted just by people that do, in fact, create pollution. And how do we account for that? Because we have to spend money to control it, for example. Congestion costs. You know, I can't think of a example except that maybe, even traffic congestion could consider to be a market distortion in some ways. Any kind of price or quantity restrictions that cause demand price to differ from the marginal cost, those are always going to distort those markets. So here we kind of hearken to one of the figures in the three sides of the Harburger Triangle paper that I had you guys read. As you can see, the area, the shaded area, sorry, you can barely see it, this labeled the Harburger Triangle is in fact what we call dead weight loss, right? It's the reduction in consumer and producer surplus that happens for no other reason except that taxes exist. As you can see, the supply uh, decreased as a result of taxes, but the price ended up increasing. So when you went from P to P1 to P2, and you went from quantity one down to quantity two, you actually created a dead weight loss situation with the triangle that you see there with the arrow. It makes sense that as the price rises, um, as you can see from P to P1 and P2, nobody benefited except the taxes, right? No one benefited, and you literally had a portion, which is the Harburger Triangle. You literally have that portion from P to A back up to the P2 where it intersects, and all the way back down to P. That little triangle right there, it created dead weight loss that nobody got the benefit of. Here's another particular case where you had a market supply without tax, you had the market supply with tax that went down, you had the demand that went from a willingness to pay there, it went down. As a result, you had people that did not buy, right? So that's why you had dead weight loss, is because you went up in price, you went down. It's the exact opposite of the free market where the price and the demand, the price determines what the quantity is. In this particular case, the price is determined by the price plus the amount of tax. And by having that tax also, you decrease the amount of the supply. So you create this triangle area there where, again, nobody benefits because it didn't happen as a result of the dead weight. Okay, so increased demand from the CBA project. What that really means, and this looks a lot more complex than it truly is, we're assuming that the CBA project increases demand for this particular output or intermediate. The increased demand from the project shifts both of these demand curves outward. The after-tax or the marginal revenue curve will move right as well as the after-tax demand curve, as you can see. These new curves are shown as DN plus P, so the yellow hatched line, and DG plus P, right? So um, you actually end up adding a new color so that you can sort of see how this shift happens. The supply curves are unaffected by the increase in demand, but the increased demand raises both the demand price and the market price as shown on the chart. So when demand price moves to PD1 while the market price moves to PM1, again, the production point is where MR equals MC, right? So the marginal return equals the marginal cost. The production point moves from Q0 to Q1 Okay, you see that on the graph. The shift in demand price is equal to the shift in the market price. So the new demand price of PD1 is shown on the chart above, which is where supply curve with tax intersects the new willingness to pay or demand curve DG plus P. So you can see how that the CBA actually causes the demand to increase as a result of the CBA project. So I'm just going to skip a little bit forward to step 4, where we see the consumption effect, and that's the area under the shaded pink area. While the total quantity in the market expands due to the additional consumption by the CBA project, the resulting price rise leads to curtailment of consumption by other buyers in the market. So that additional consumption actually causes others in the marketplace to decrease their consumption. So the cutback in consumption by other buyers, Harburger calls this the consumption effect, is where the new demand price of PD1 that you see on the chart intersects the original willingness to pay or demand curve DG. So that drop in consumption by other buyers at that point, QD1, on the horizontal axis is actually what we refer to as a consumption effect. Conversely, on the resource cost effect, what you find is the additional consumption from the CBA project consumes additional resources. The cost of the additional resources are valued at the marginal cost times the additional quantity according to the second of Harburger's postulates. The marginal cost curve is without tax supply curve, okay? So the quantity of resources consumed then by the CDA project consists of this quantity between Q1S and Q0. So this yellow shaded area then is the resource cost effect. All right, I'm going to sort of skip forward at this point. Obviously, this you can still look at and see what the difference between, you can see where the difference between the financial and economic costs are. We just talked about that. Well, what I want you to be able to do is make sure that in this particular case, and again, I'm sort of skipping ahead, you can look at what the economic benefits in a tax distorted market are. Let's look. Again, I'm skipping over this. You're not going to be responsible for any of this information, but just this can help you determine um, the actual benefits or costs, as it were, of a tax effect on a CBA that maybe you do in your project. If you really want to get granular in terms of understanding exactly what those rates are. There's an interesting little, it's not a hot link here, but if you actually go to econgraphs.org, there's actually some input output that you can do here to help you sort of see to kind of simulate what happens to the size of the consumption and resource cost effects when you vary the elasticity of supply and demand. So if you sort of put some different scenarios in here, you can actually simulate what happens. So I'd encourage you, if you have a few minutes, to give it a try. Here's a chart that actually shows you the formulas to actually precisely estimate economic distortion from sales taxes. If you want to do that, feel free to do that. It might be of some benefit to you in the future. You probably aren't going to have to parse these out as exactly as you might, but just recognize that if prices don't change in the local or regional market as a result of a CBA project, then you really you have no distortions, and that sort of stands to reason. You can also talk about weighting quantities and the demand. You know, again, interesting concept. You won't be responsible for it. Real world importance of tax distortion. Sometimes building a table like this using your demand elasticity and supply elasticity, you can tell that since supply elasticities do tend to be larger than demand elasticities, we kind of talked about that in our discussion last week. The resource cost effect tends to have more influence and distortions than consumption effects. That kind of stands to reason as well. Um, but then it's really important on this last slide, and I want you to take a little bit of time with this and make sure that you grasp it, is that CBA truly is a measurement tool for specific projects and policies. And these are used throughout the United States for so many different things, but we use them a lot in economic development. The goal of these and why this is important is as we mentioned several slides back, there's always the choice of doing absolutely nothing or doing the without project condition. There's always that choice. If we do nothing, then what's going to happen? But if we do something, if we do a project, then these, in fact, by virtue of the fact that you demonstrate this in a CBA, these are in fact going to be, this is going to be the net benefit. And you do it by net present value. You can do it by benefit cost ratio, like Donovan did in the Corps of Engineers CBA. You show that, but that's for that particular project. Well, you almost never have just one project. You can have you can have an iteration on a project, which is what's happening in your group project. Is okay, if we offer this level of tax incentives, here's what it's going to look like. If we offer this level, then here's what it's going to look like. In most cases, in most communities, they have a finite amount of money. They have a without project condition, which is zero, do nothing, status quo. But then they can build a new park, or they can spend money to incent and recruit a company to the area. So what are the net benefits? What are we going to be spending, and what are our benefits going to be if we build a new park? And then what is the CBA going to be if we bring in the company and we give them a bunch of tax incentives? You always have choices that you have to deal with. You have to have a way of evaluating those on an apples to apples, oranges to oranges basis. And that's what CBA is all about. The goal of CBA analysis is to eliminate projects where social costs exceed social benefits, right? Hey, it's great if you've got a company that's going to come into your community and create a bunch of jobs. But if they're a terrible polluter, if they're going to be noisy, if your community is going to lose residents because they're particularly smelly, or any of those things, um, you may not want them. So you always want to make sure that your social you want to eliminate those projects that the social cost just far exceed any benefits socially that you're going to get. Project benefits are equal to social benefits in the case of undistorted markets. Most of the time when we're doing calculations in economic development, we're making that case to an extent, but we also need to be able to understand what the distortions to the markets are going to cause, and we want to minimize the amount of dead weight loss. We just do. The consumption and resource cost components of CBA typically occur in distorted markets. So let me say that one more time. The consumption and resource cost components of CBA projects typically occur in distorted markets. And when change in market price is small, net economic benefits are greater than financial benefits by the amount of additional tax revenue collected by government. So, in other words, by doing a project that requires some level of expenditure, some level of cost, some level of investment in the community, as long as it doesn't make the prices go up, or if they go up, they're going to go up marginally, then the net benefits are usually greater than the financial benefits only to the extent that government receives more taxes. And a lot of CBA projects are decided yes or no based on how much more tax revenue that they add to the community. So, lot to digest. I would encourage you to go back over this and look at the scenario where, and again, I'll kind of, I think I'll send this to you separately as well, just in case whenever I zoomed it in or zoomed it out, you might have missed some of the actual verbiage. And I would encourage you maybe to go back through and reread some of those things. But this is pretty critical. This week is important so that we understand the fundamentals as to why CBAs are done the way they are and how to look at the CBA from the standpoint of um, what are some processes that you go through as you're doing a project, and then what are the critical things that you need to be paying attention to with CBA, and understand that what you're seeking out here is always the positive net benefits. So that's all for today, and we'll go on to the next module next week.